What if I told you that American independence didn't start with the Declaration of Independence? What if the real beginning of our nation happened 2 years earlier in a Carpenters meeting hall, where 56 men from different colonies made a decision that would change the world forever? These weren't soldiers or revolutionaries, they were lawyers, merchants, and planters who still called themselves loyal British subjects. But in just 7 weeks, they would create something that had never existed before, America's first united government. Welcome to Liberty Unfolded, where we explore the moments that shaped human liberty, and today we're traveling back to 1774, to one of the most pivotal moments in the fight for freedom. In 1774, the American colonies were facing their darkest hour. Britain had just passed the most punitive laws in colonial history, laws so harsh that Americans called them the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was sealed shut. Massachusetts had lost its right to self-government. British soldiers were being forced into American homes, but instead of crushing colonial resistance, these brutal laws did something unexpected. They united 13 separate colonies into one angry, determined force, and that force was about to meet in Philadelphia to change history. This is the story of the First Continental Congress, the meeting that transformed scattered colonial complaints into organized American resistance. It's the story of how our nation's first government was born not from revolution, but from a desperate attempt to avoid one. King George Roman III and the British Parliament were not amused. They decided to make an example out of Massachusetts that would send a clear message to all the other colonies: mess with us and you'll pay dearly. So they passed what they called the Coercive Acts. But here's the thing, the colonists had their own name for these laws. They called them the Intolerable Acts, and that name tells you everything you need to know about how Americans felt. These acts were brutal. First, they shut down Boston Harbor completely. No ships in, no ships out. This meant no trade, no income, and no way for people to make a living. Then they took away Massachusetts' right to govern itself. British officials would now be tried in England instead of local courts, making it nearly impossible to get justice. And if that wasn't enough, they forced colonists to house British soldiers in their own homes. But here's where the British made their biggest mistake. They thought these harsh punishments would scare the other colonies into submission. Instead, something unexpected happened. The other colonies looked at what was happening to Massachusetts and realized they could be next. For the first time, colonists from Georgia to New Hampshire started thinking of themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans facing a common threat. News traveled slowly in 1774, but when it traveled, it carried with it a powerful message. Letters flew between colonial leaders. Newspapers printed angry editorials. Town meetings buzzed with talk of resistance. What started as punishment for one colony was quickly becoming a rallying cry for all of them. The colonists began to understand that their individual grievances were actually part of a much larger pattern. British policies weren't just targeting Boston, they were systematically stripping away the rights that colonists believed they deserved as British citizens. This realization was like a spark landing on dry kindling. Samuel Adams, one of the masterminds behind the Boston Tea Party, saw this moment as an opportunity. He started writing letters to leaders in other colonies, urging them to stand together. His message was simple but powerful. If the British could do this to Massachusetts today, they could do it to any colony tomorrow. The response was immediate and widespread. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston. New York merchants began organizing boycotts of British goods. Even in far-off South Carolina, planters were talking about the need for united action. This wasn't just political theater. Real people were making real sacrifices. Merchants who had built their businesses on British trade were willing to give up profits. Ordinary colonists were choosing more expensive local goods over cheaper British imports. Families were having serious conversations around dinner tables about what it meant to be free. The Intolerable Acts had done something that decades of British rule had failed to accomplish. They had created a shared identity among the colonies. No longer were they just individual settlements trying to survive in the New World. They were becoming Americans, and they were angry, but anger alone wasn't enough. The colonists needed a plan, and they needed to coordinate their response. That's when leaders across the colony started talking about something that had never been done before, a gathering of representatives from all the colonies to decide on a unified course of action. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They didn't want revolution, they wanted fairness. They wanted their rights as Englishmen respected. But the Intolerable Acts had pushed them to a breaking point where they realized that polite petitions and individual protests weren't working. The stage was set for something unprecedented in American history. The crisis that Britain had created to divide and conquer the colonies was about to bring them together in ways that would change the world forever. September 5th, 1774. If you had been walking through Philadelphia that morning, you would have witnessed something extraordinary. Carriages were arriving from all directions, carrying men who would soon make history. These weren't just any travelers, these were delegates representing nearly every American colony, coming together for a meeting that had never happened before. Philadelphia was the perfect choice for this gathering. It was the largest city in America, centrally located and already known as a place where big ideas flourished. The city's taverns and coffee houses were buzzing with conversation as delegates arrived from as far north as New Hampshire and as far south as South Carolina. But here's what made this moment so remarkable. Just getting to Philadelphia was a statement in itself. In 1770, travel was difficult, expensive, and dangerous. Roads were rough, weather was unpredictable, and the journey could take weeks. Yet despite these challenges, colony after colony sent their best and brightest. Virginia sent a delegation that read like a who's who of American leadership. George Washington was there, yes, the same Washington who would later become our first president. At this point, though, he was known primarily as a successful planter and veteran of the French and Indian War. Alongside him came Patrick Henry, the fiery orator who would later declare, "Give me liberty or give me death," and Edmund Pendleton, one of Virginia's most respected lawyers. Massachusetts sent the Adams cousins Samuel and John. Samuel was the radical organizer who had helped orchestrate the Boston Tea Party. John was the brilliant lawyer who had actually defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, showing that even in times of crisis, he believed in justice and the rule of law. These two men represented the different sides of the colonial resistance movement, the passionate activist and the thoughtful legal mind. From Pennsylvania came Joseph Galloway, a wealthy lawyer who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. South Carolina sent John and Edward Rutledge, rice planters who brought the perspective of the southern colonies. New York sent John Jay, a young lawyer who would later become one of the founding fathers. What's fascinating is how different these men were from each other. They came from different backgrounds, different economic situations, and different regions with different concerns. Northern merchants worried about trade, southern planters worried about their agricultural exports. Frontier settlers worried about land rights and protection from Native American attacks. The delegates didn't even agree on what they wanted to accomplish. Some, like Joseph Galloway, still hoped to find a peaceful solution that would keep the colony within the British Empire. Others, like Samuel Adams, were already thinking that independence might be necessary. Most fell somewhere in between, hoping for a middle ground that would protect colonial rights without breaking ties with Britain completely. Only Georgia failed to send delegates, and that wasn't because they supported British policies. Georgia was the youngest colony, still heavily dependent on British military protection against Spanish Florida and local Native American tribes. They simply couldn't afford to risk angering their protectors. The delegates faced a crucial question right from the start. Where should they meet? They chose Carpenters Hall, a beautiful building that had just been completed by the city's Carpenters Guild. This choice was significant. They could have met in the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, but that was controlled by the Pennsylvania government. By choosing Carpenters Hall, they were making a statement that this was an independent gathering, not controlled by any single colony's government. When the delegates walked into Carpenters Hall on that first day, they were stepping into uncharted territory. There was no precedent for what they were doing. The British Empire had no mechanism for colonies to meet together like this. In fact, such meetings were generally forbidden. By simply showing up, these men were committing what many would consider an act of rebellion. The atmosphere must have been electric. Picture 56 men from different colonies, many meeting each other for the first time, all aware that they were participating in something historic. They were polite and formal, as was expected of gentlemen in that era, but underneath the courtesy was a shared sense of purpose and urgency. They elected Peyton Randolph of Virginia as their president and Charles Thompson of Pennsylvania as their secretary. These weren't just ceremonial positions. These men would guide the proceedings and help turn a gathering of frustrated colonists into an organized political body. The fact that 12 colonies had managed to coordinate this meeting at all was remarkable. Remember, there was no internet, no telephone, no fast communication. Everything had to be arranged through letters that took weeks to travel between colonies. The logistics alone were a triumph of colonial cooperation. As the delegates settled into their work, they were creating something entirely new, a truly American political body that represented the will of the people rather than the wishes of a distant king. Inside Carpenters Hall, something revolutionary was taking shape, though delegates might not have realized it at the time. They were having a conversation that would fundamentally challenge the entire British system of government. The question on the table wasn't just about taxes or trade, it was about the very nature of rights and citizenship. For over a century, American colonists had lived with a contradiction. They were British subjects, but they didn't have the same rights as British subjects living in England. They paid taxes, but they had no representatives in Parliament. They were subject to British laws, but they had no say in making those laws. This contradiction had been simmering beneath the surface of colonial life for generations. Now, faced with the Intolerable Acts, the delegates were forced to confront this contradiction head-on. Their solution was both simple and radical. They declared that colonists should have exactly the same rights as any Englishman living in London. This might sound obvious to us today, but in 1774, it was a revolutionary concept. The British system was built on the idea that different parts of the empire could have different rights and privileges. People in Ireland had different rights than people in England. People in India had different rights than people in Ireland. The colonies were just another part of this hierarchical system, but the American delegates rejected this hierarchy completely. They argued that rights weren't privileges to be granted or taken away by government. They were fundamental entitlements that all people possessed simply by being human. This was a direct challenge to the entire British understanding of how government should work. John Adams captured this idea perfectly in his notes from the Congress. He wrote about the rights of Englishmen, but he meant something very specific. These weren't just legal privileges, they were fundamental protections that no government should be able to violate. The right to trial by jury, the right to be free from unreasonable searches, the right to have a say in the laws that governed them. The delegates spent hours debating exactly what these rights included. Some wanted to base their claims on the British Constitution. Others argued that they should base their claims on natural law, the idea that certain rights come from God or nature, not from government. Still others wanted to base their claims on the colonial charters that had originally established their governments. This debate was more than academic philosophy. The delegates understood that how they justified their rights would determine how strong their argument was. If their rights came from the British Constitution, then Parliament could change the Constitution and take those rights away. But if their rights came from natural law, then no government could legitimately violate them. The compromise they reached was brilliant. They decided to base their claims on all three sources: the British Constitution, natural law, and their colonial charters. This gave them the strongest possible legal foundation for their demands, but claiming these rights was only half the battle. The delegates also had to explain why colonists deserved the same rights as people living in Britain. Here, they made an argument that would echo through American history. They argued that colonists had actually earned their rights through their contributions to the British Empire. They pointed out that colonists had fought and died in British wars. They had built thriving communities that contributed to British wealth. They had remained loyal subjects even when that loyalty was costly. In short, they had fulfilled their obligations as British subjects, and they deserved to be treated as equals in return. This argument was particularly powerful because it turned British accusations on their head. British officials often portrayed colonists as ungrateful subjects who didn't appreciate British protection. But the delegates argued that it was Britain that was being ungrateful, ignoring colonial contributions while demanding colonial obedience. The psychological impact of this declaration was enormous. For the first time, colonists were articulating a clear vision of what their relationship with Britain should look like. They weren't asking for independence, they were asking for equality. They weren't rejecting British rule, they were demanding that British rule be fair and just. This distinction was crucial because it allowed colonists who still considered themselves loyal British subjects to support the Congress's position. They could oppose the Intolerable Acts without feeling like they were betraying their country. They were simply demanding that their country live up to its own values. The declaration also had international implications. By basing their claims on British law and British precedent, the delegates were appealing to British public opinion. They were saying, in effect, we're not asking for anything that you wouldn't want for yourselves. But perhaps most importantly, this declaration planted the seeds of American independence. Once colonists started thinking of themselves as equals rather than subjects, it became much harder for them to accept unequal treatment. The idea that rights belonged to people rather than governments would eventually lead to the conclusion that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed. The delegates probably didn't realize it at the time, but by declaring their equality with Englishmen, they were taking the first step toward declaring their independence from England. The delegates in Philadelphia faced a practical problem. How do you fight an empire without an army? Their answer was both simple and sophisticated. You hit them where it hurts most. You target their wallet. The Continental Association wasn't just a boycott. It was the first coordinated economic warfare campaign in American history, and it was remarkably well planned. The delegates understood that Britain's relationship with the colonies was fundamentally economic. The colonies provided raw materials and bought finished goods. If that relationship could be disrupted, Britain would feel the pain immediately. But here's what made this strategy so clever. The delegates structured their economic resistance in stages, giving Britain multiple opportunities to back down while steadily increasing the pressure. First came the Non-Importation Agreement. Starting December 1, 1774, the colony would stop importing British goods. This would hurt British manufacturers and merchants who depended on American customers. The delegates carefully chose this date to give British merchants time to feel the impact before the next parliamentary session. Then came non-consumption. Colonists wouldn't just stop buying new British goods, they would stop using British goods they already owned. This meant drinking coffee instead of tea, wearing homespun clothes instead of British fabric, and finding local alternatives to British products. This turned every household decision into an act of political resistance. Finally, if Britain still refused to repeal the Intolerable Acts, the colonies would implement non-exportation starting September 10, 1775. This was the nuclear option. American exports tobacco, rice, indigo, lumber, furs were crucial to British prosperity. Cutting off these exports would devastate entire sectors of the British economy. The genius of this plan was its flexibility. Each stage could be implemented independently, allowing the colonies to calibrate their response to British actions. If Britain showed signs of compromise, the colonies could ease their economic pressure. If Britain remained stubborn, they could escalate. But the Continental Association was more than just an economic strategy. It was a blueprint for colonial self-government. The delegates didn't just agree to boycott British goods. They created an enforcement mechanism that reached into every community across America. Each colony was supposed to choose committees to monitor compliance with the association. These committees would keep lists of merchants who violated the boycott and publish their names in newspapers. Violators would be socially ostracized, cut off from their communities until they agreed to comply. This system was revolutionary because it created a parallel government structure that operated independently of British authority. These committees answered to the Continental Congress, not to British officials. They enforced American law, not British law. In effect, the Continental Association was creating the infrastructure for independence even while claiming to seek reconciliation. The social pressure was intense. In small colonial communities, everyone knew everyone else. Having your name published as an enemy of American liberty could destroy your business and your reputation. This peer pressure proved remarkably effective at ensuring compliance. Women played a crucial role in making the association work. Since women made most household purchasing decisions, their participation was essential. They organized spinning bees to produce homespun cloth. They served coffee instead of tea at social gatherings. They taught their children that using British goods was unpatriotic. The association also encouraged American manufacturing. If colonists couldn't buy British goods, they needed alternatives. Local craftsmen suddenly found new markets for their products. New industries sprang up to meet demand for goods that had previously been imported. This economic development would prove crucial when the colonies eventually declared independence. The speed with which the association spread across America was remarkable. Within months, committees were operating in towns from New Hampshire to Georgia. Local newspapers published the names of violators. Merchants who tried to circumvent the boycott found themselves facing organized resistance. The British response revealed just how effective the association was. British merchants immediately began lobbying Parliament for repeal of the Intolerable Acts. Port cities like Liverpool and Bristol, which depended heavily on American trade, saw their economies contract rapidly. British manufacturers who had built their businesses around American customers faced potential bankruptcy, but the association did more than hurt the British economy. It transformed American society. Colonists who had never thought much about politics suddenly found themselves making political decisions every day. What to buy, what to wear, what to eat. All of these became political choices. The association also created new forms of American identity. Colonists began to take pride in their homespun clothes and their local products. They developed a sense of shared sacrifice and common purpose. British goods became symbols of oppression, while American-made goods became symbols of freedom. Perhaps most importantly, the association proved that the colonies could work together effectively. When the time came to declare independence, colonists already had experience with unified action. They had already created the institutions and the habits of cooperation that would be necessary for successful resistance. The Continental Association was economic warfare, but it was also something more. It was a dress rehearsal for revolution. Even as the delegates organized their economic warfare campaign, they held on to hope that reason might still prevail. These weren't radicals seeking revolution, they were loyal British subjects seeking justice. So alongside their plans for resistance, they crafted what they hoped would be their final appeal to the crown, the petition to the king. This petition was a masterpiece of diplomatic language, carefully crafted to show respect for the monarchy while firmly stating colonial grievances. The delegates understood that they were walking a tightrope. They needed to be firm enough to make their point, but respectful enough to avoid giving offense. Too harsh, and they would be dismissed as rebels. Too soft, and they would be ignored as harmless complainers. The petition began with the traditional language of loyal subjects addressing their sovereign. The delegates referred to themselves as Your Majesty's faithful subjects and expressed their duty and affection to Crown, this wasn't just politeness, it was strategy. By emphasizing their loyalty, they were making it clear that their grievances came from disappointed subjects, not from enemies of the realm. But beneath the flowery language was a detailed catalog of American complaints. The delegates methodically listed each violation of colonial rights, explaining how British policies contradicted established legal principles. They pointed out that the Intolerable Acts violated the British Constitution itself, making Parliament the violator of British law. The petition was particularly clever in how it separated the King from Parliament. The delegates suggested that King George Roman III was being misled by bad advisors in Parliament. They appealed to him as the protector of British liberty, asking him to intervene on behalf of his American subjects. This strategy allowed them to criticize British policy without directly attacking the monarchy. The delegates also made an economic argument that they knew would resonate in London. They pointed out that the current crisis was hurting British trade and British prosperity. They suggested that restoring harmony with the colonies would benefit both sides of the Atlantic. This wasn't just about American rights, it was about British interests. But perhaps the most powerful part of the petition was its emotional appeal. The delegates wrote about their affection for Britain and their desire to remain part of the British family. They described the current crisis as a family dispute that could be resolved through understanding and compromise. They weren't seeking to break away, they were seeking to come home. The petition was signed by every delegate present, representing the unanimous voice of American opinion. This wasn't the complaint of a few troublemakers, it was the formal appeal of an entire continent. The delegates hoped that this show of unity would convince the king that the situation was serious enough to require his personal attention. Getting the petition to London was itself a challenge. There was no postal service between the colonies and Britain, so private arrangements had to be made. The delegates chose their messengers carefully, selecting men who had connections at court and could present the American case effectively. The wait for a response was agonizing. Communication across the Atlantic took months, and the delegates had no way of knowing whether their petition had even reached the king. Meanwhile, tensions in America continued to escalate. British officials were implementing the Intolerable Acts more aggressively. Colonial resistance was growing more organized. Both sides were preparing for confrontation while hoping for reconciliation. When King George Roman III's response finally came, it was devastating. The king not only rejected the petition, he refused to receive it at all. In his view, the Continental Congress was an illegal assembly, and its petition was therefore invalid. By even sending the petition, the colonists had committed an act of rebellion that put them outside the protection of British law. This rejection was more than a diplomatic setback, it was a psychological watershed. For many colonists, the king had been their last hope. Peaceful resolution. They had been willing to blame Parliament, to blame the king's advisors, to blame anyone except the king himself. But the king's rejection of their petition made it clear that the problems came from the very top of the British system. The rejection also revealed the fundamental incompatibility between American and British views of the empire. The colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects seeking justice. The British government saw them as rebels challenging legitimate authority. There was no middle ground between these positions. News of the king's rejection spread quickly through the colonies, and its impact was immediate. Colonists who had supported the Continental Congress as a way to avoid revolution now began to think that revolution might be inevitable. If the king wouldn't listen to reason, if he wouldn't even receive their petitions, then what alternatives were left? The psychological impact was particularly strong because the petition had represented everything that colonial moderates believed in. It had been respectful, legal, and reasonable. It had followed all the proper forms and procedures. It had appealed to British law, British precedent. If this approach couldn't work, then perhaps the radical argument was correct. Perhaps the only way to secure American rights was through American independence. The failed petition also had practical consequences. It convinced many colonists that further appeals to British authority would be pointless. When the Second Continental Congress met the following year, the delegates were much more willing to consider radical solutions. The failure of diplomacy made the success of revolution more likely. Looking back, historians often point to the king's rejection of the petition as the moment when American independence became inevitable. The colonists had offered Britain one last chance to resolve the crisis peacefully. When that offer was rejected, the path to revolution was clear. The loyal subjects who had crafted that petition would soon become the founding fathers of a new nation. The First Continental Congress ended on October 26, 1774, but its impact was just beginning. In less than 2 months, these 56 delegates had accomplished something extraordinary. They had taken 13 separate colonies with different interests, different economies and different cultures, and turned them into a unified political force. They had created America's first national government not through revolution, but through cooperation. They had established the principle that Americans deserved the same rights as any British citizen. They had launched the first coordinated economic warfare campaign in history, and when their peaceful appeals were rejected, they had laid the groundwork for independence. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. None of these men set out to create a new nation. They wanted to fix the old one. They believed in British liberty so strongly that they were willing to risk everything to defend it. When Britain rejected their vision of liberty, they had no choice but to create their own. The Carpenters' Hall where they met still stands in Philadelphia today. You can visit it and see where American independence really began, not with a declaration of war, but with a declaration of rights. Not with the rejection of British values, but with the demand that those values be honored. The First Continental Congress proved something that would become fundamental to American identity. When people come together around shared principles, they can accomplish extraordinary things. These 56 men showed us that liberty isn't just an idea, it's something worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, and worth building a nation around. The revolution that followed was inevitable, but it wasn't the beginning of American freedom. That began in 1774, when ordinary people decided they deserved extraordinary rights. What do you think? Could the crisis have been resolved peacefully if Britain had listened to the Continental Congress? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about the incredible stories behind America's founding, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The story of liberty is far from over, it's still being written every day.